The following program contains the views and opinions of the host, speakers, and participants. They do not reflect the policies of the producers, advertisers, and advisors of AU Paws Radio, including Adelphi University's Board of Trustees, administrative faculty, or its affiliates. AU Paws radio station encourages freedom of speech, but does not endorse any specific viewpoints or messages. Listener discretion is advised, especially for potentially sensitive or controversial topics. Hello everyone, welcome back to the second episode of the Earle Lab. This is your host Hemish, a junior molecular neuroscience major and also Asian studies and biology minor. On today's first real episode of the podcast, we're going to be outlining a subject that I feel most people struggle with and could really use help with, especially for college students, and that is how can we study better? How can we remember stuff? How can we improve studying effectiveness through better memorization? So throughout this episode, I'll be going over, first of all, some of the neural mechanisms behind memory, just to provide some background context on what we're dealing with. Also talking a little bit about sleep, not too much. And then we're going to use that information to try and come up with some innovative, but also tried and true studying techniques that could really help you remember things easier. So this goes out to all of those STEM students who have maybe a bio test or a neurobio quiz, and they have to remember 50 million definitions. This one's for you guys. And also just for any student who seems to struggle with remembering ideas and concepts in a short time frame. So let's start off by talking about how exactly memory works in the brain. So this is some psych overview, but memory can be divided into two components. First, we have our short-term memory, known scientifically as the working memory, and then we have our much more expansive long-term memory. So working memory is very limited in the information that it can contain. Think like you can only remember so many things at one point before you forget a few. Whereas long-term memory is theoretically actually infinite. So this is information that we can't quite remember right away, but we can, after some moments of thinking, get that information, retrieve it, put it into our working memory, and apply it. So this process entails, first of all, we have to take the information that we want to memorize and encode it into our working memory. From there, we undergo storage, where from our working memory, this information can either be forgotten or stored into our long-term memory. And then lastly, retrieval, which I touched upon just now. You take some of that information from your long-term memory and bring it back to your working memory, typically using some sort of cues to help you remember certain ideas is really effective in this category. And when I talk about like encoding and retrieving, so what's really going on there is in your brain, a lot of neurons are firing. There's a lot of synaptic connections going on. In fact, it's these connections between, like the junctions between your neurons that are really responsible for how we think and our efficiency to think productively. So some brain regions involved in memory. First of all, we have the hippocampus. This one is probably more commonly known. It's pretty deep in your brain, like really tucked in. And this is the brain region that you're taught is usually most commonly associated with sleep. And to be even more precise, we're talking about the dorsal hippocampus, which is like the upper hippocampus region. A lot of neuroscience studies have focused on the CA1 and CA2 regions, which are sort of subregions of the hippocampus that tend to be shown to be most active during memorization. It's like during fMRI studies or EEG studies. These are the areas that light up. And this is where signals are most commonly traced from. More on signals in a minute. And again, these help with encoding, storage, and retrieval. However, this is a new development in cognitive neuroscience, especially memory is not really specific to one brain region, but rather it works together across other brain regions through complex neural networks. So rather than molecular consolidation or the process of remembering things through just those synaptic connections that I touched upon earlier, instead we have systems consolidation, where brain regions such as the hippocampus and the cortex, neocortex, work together, fire together, and through those that cooperation, we can integrate our memories more into our long-term memory easier. So just to provide a more specific example, I talked about the CA1 region hippocampus and the somatosensory cortex, which is basically where all of our touch information gets processed. So anytime we feel something, we feel pain, we feel a change in temperature or pressure, all of that goes to our somatosensory cortex, which then gets interpreted by the brain through neural firing. So research has shown that during sleep, a phase of sleep known as slow wave sleep, which is like deep sleep, kind of before like REM sleep, rapid eye movement, the CA1 region, the somatosensory cortex fire together. So either they fire at the same time, or when one region fires, that causes the other region to fire shortly afterward. So I just bring this up real quick to show that there's so many different parts of the brain that are responsible for memory, because memory is such a tricky thing to consolidate and for the brain to manage. So don't feel bad if you have trouble remembering things. Your brain does struggle with it as well. And it really can only do so effectively during sleep when other neural processes are less active. So on the topic of sleep, this is of course the main method for memory storage and consolidation. And during sleep, our brain emits something called delta waves. Delta waves are what the brain fires out to make you feel sleepy. Anytime you feel sleepy, anytime you feel tired, anytime you feel groggy, like when you're about to fall asleep, when you're taking a nap, when you're sitting through an 8 a.m. lecture, these are the waves that your brain fires to make you feel that way. It's also these waves that help to sort of modulate, and this is ongoing research, but from what it seems so far, they help to hold together this relationship between brain regions and are therefore super, super, super duper important for memory. To put this all together, sleep is needed to remember things, right? Don't pull an all-nighter when you study. Don't cram things last minute. I've heard of some of my friends, some other students, they tend to study after they wake up in the morning before an exam. Try to avoid this because you're just making it harder for yourself and for your brain to sort of keep that information locked in. It can't really consolidate it since there's so much else that your brain has to navigate, so many other synaptic connections that it has to provide energy to. So make it a little bit easier for yourself, right? Sleep after you study and after you try to remember stuff. And if time's an issue, well, we can talk about that, how we can sort of circumvent that in a sec. And one last note on sleep. This is actually really fun. During sleep, your brain is thought, this is a common theory, it actually replays some of your memories throughout the day to your subconscious. Oversimplification, but this sort of system of replay, which is really just those neurons firing off in coordinated manners, is what helps to consolidate your memory. And it's thought that these could occur across different cortices of the brain. So I talked about the somatosensory cortex. There's also the potential for the frontal cortex, which is involved in your personality and just general thinking, right, to also play a heavy role. All right, that's enough of the neuroscience lecture, but hopefully you guys get the idea about how memory works now and how sleep is very integral to that. I could talk for hours about sleep, but that deserves another episode on its own. But yeah, just know that the delta waves that are emitted when you sleep help your brain to keep things in your long-term memory, make it easier to bring it back to your short-term memory, and it involves so many different brain regions that you need that rest for it to work effectively. All right, how can we use that information to study better? Why did I just yap on and on about all this neuroscience stuff if it can't help you? Well, we can first apply some of this information to the idea of chunking. So again, this might be some gen psych review to some of you. Chunking is when you take pieces of information that you are trying to store in your long-term memory and you basically sort of combine it into groups. So imagine like you're studying like flashcards, right? Instead of trying to remember each word individually, try to categorize them into groups and remember the groups. Focus on the groups first. And the association between the groups and all the words that you're remembering. And then ideally from there, when you remember a group, you can remember all the words associated with it. So to expand on that a little bit, let's say that you use like Quizlet a lot. A lot of people do, obviously it's really helpful. But one of the issues with Quizlets is that they can only present information to you one flashcard at a time. They can't really group it together effectively. So one way to navigate around this and to help with that, you could make your own flashcards or take a set, maybe copy it, edit, and then for each word at the end of the definition, you can attach a group onto it. So like in parentheses, And then if you're like trying to remember like DNA, like stuff about DNA, you could just put in parentheses the group DNA. And then you're going to focus on making that connection between definition or the word and the group. So now that you have all of those groups remembered, right, instead of memorizing 100 words or 50 words, you just have to remember 10 or 5 groups. Way easier to put into your working memory, which again, to remind you guys, is very limited no matter what you try. So you're going to remember that. And then because you worked so long on making those associations between word and group, anytime you remember a group, your brain will automatically use that as a cue, right? This is the cue that I talked about that helps with retrieval. It'll use that group as a cue to retrieve all the associated words that are part of that group. And then from there, those words will be a cue to help you remember definitions. So it's sort of like a pyramid, right? You start very broad and you get narrow, narrow, narrow. Obviously, one big drawback is that this takes a lot of time, but while there are shortcuts we can use, the best outcomes that you will have will arise from using these groups and just making sure that you set aside a few hours. Okay, so that's the flashcards done. Now, after you've worked on that, we can take this a step further and utilize something, developing theory in neuroscience called the spacing effect. The spacing effect refers to the idea that if you remind yourself of ideas or concepts, not back to back, but after a set time interval, you can remember them better. So let's say that you've gone through a set of flashcards, right? You've done the chunking method, you put them into groups, you remember the groups, and then you can remember all the words associated with the group. What you can do as a first step to make you feel more confident in your retrieval abilities is to try that again, repeat that same process, but do it an hour afterwards. Or if you're on a stricter time frame, 30 minutes afterwards. If you have more time available, maybe you're studying a few days in advance, maybe like 2 hours afterwards. And then you can go even beyond that, where you can begin mixing and matching words from different groups. So this is why I sort of call this step 2, because you really need to have those groups down pat. So after you remember words from one group, or after you remember a group, I should say, and then remember one word from it, don't try and remember other words from that same group. Try to exercise your brain. Try to then go to a different group, remember a word from that group, then go to a different group, remember a word from that group. Keep going between groups. It'll be very confusing at first, but this will help you because another core component of the spacing effect is variability. So first is the actual spacing, the intervals. The second part is variability. You need to have your brain get used to associating these words, these groups, with contexts that they're not already familiar with. Because if you begin just remembering words, like all the words with a group, then let's say on a test, right? You have to maybe do like an essay style question where you're gonna have to write about, the connection between this concept and that concept. Well, you might have a hard time remembering what those concepts are because you only related them to their very narrow groups. But with the spacing effect and with that variability component, and you constantly going back and forth between the groups, you're much more comfortable with that stark adjustments. You're much more comfortable with using that chunking to sort of think critically. And again, another drawback, this is very time consuming. So if you don't have that much time available, maybe you only have like 2-3 hours to study, it happens. Then the spacing effect actually says, okay, then you can try studying back to back, because studying back to back is better than trying to just wait and then not having the time to repeat it. So repeatability is key here, but if you can help it, try to space them out and try to associate them with different ideas after you've done the chunking. And then final advice I can give you, kind of a summary, and I'm kind of repeating myself a bit like a broken record player, but get better sleep. Sleep cannot be, let me rephrase that actually. Sleep is the central, most important thing to studying and remembering ideas. I know that there are people there who get a lot of sleep and can't remember concepts effectively. However, sleep has to be done in conjunction with the other studying things I just gave you, right? So once you've done your chunking, once you've practice the spacing effect. By the way, all the spacing effect especially has been very heavily proven in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience through extensive studies. Once you've done all that, right, you have a new day ahead of you, right? You have your exam ahead of you. Your brain is tired. You need to allow those neurons to rest so that way your brain can focus, again, on that systems consolidation. Your hippocampus, your somatosensory cortex, your other brain regions, they can be sort of front and center, doing their job, helping consolidate that information, firing those electrical signals. And because other brain regions are more inactive, and there's more delta waves present, it's just easier for you. A big issue is that you can do all this and then you can just forget it come time to do the exam, right? You either get nervous, or because you've tried to remember so much information in a short time span, some information just inevitably spills out. Take care of your hippocampus, take care of your brain, and that will help ease your anxiety. You'll be able to retrieve information quickly, and you'll be able to retrieve more information in a short time frame, and you'll be able to have a less anxious and frustrating time during your exams, and hopefully you will be able to get better scores. This episode was actually a little bit more dense than what I initially expected, but the bottom line is that studying as a college student, when you have like 5 or 6 other classes going on, it's no easy feat. Make it easier for yourself. And again, just try to incorporate, you don't have to incorporate everything from this podcast, but maybe just like keep a few of these things in the back of your head. And yeah, it could help you maybe get a few extra points. All right. This has been another episode of the Earle Lab with your host, Hemish. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Always remember to mind up each and every single day. All right. Take care.